I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to present. I'll be looking at providing an overview of some conservation issues facing the Pumicestone Passage, and I'll be doing that through the lens of private landholders who are members of the Land for Wildlife program. So it's really drilling down on maybe what Richard and Shannon talked about at more of a broader policy scale and getting onto the ground and seeing what some landholders are actually doing. So in the Pumicestone catchment, there's about 64 Land for Wildlife properties, and they're spread out over Sunshine Coast Council and Moreton Bay Council areas. Those two councils deliver the Land for Wildlife program to the landholders, and in doing so, they offer one-on-one property visits, advice, support, there's workshops, incentives, and ongoing encouragement for the landholders to undertake conservation works on their properties. My presentation today, I'm just going to divvy up the Pumicestone into three key areas. As you can see here, there's similar sort of land management issues facing the landholders in those areas, and it was just sort of an easier way of literally presenting their story to you here today. So starting with this hinterland area, we've got a real cluster of Land for Wildlife properties around that Mount Melham area, and that's on the eastern slopes of the Mount Melham, so that's part of the Pumicestone catchment. A lot of those landholders up there, they're very active in doing conservation on their properties. They often work on each other's properties, they support each other, they undertake weed management, they've undertaken flora surveys and fauna surveys on their property. So they're very active, that group at Mount Melham. A couple of those landholders have taken that next step of really conserving and protecting the conservation values on their property by entering into a voluntary conservation covenants with Sunshine Coast Council, or even a nature refuge agreement with the state government. So a big shout out to people who really take that next step and put a binding covenant on the title of their property to protect the conservation values of their property in perpetuity. So although we heard yesterday that the Pumicestone catchment as a whole has really incredibly rich Indigenous cultural heritage and continuing Indigenous values, the hinterland area provides some pretty unique opportunities for publicly accessible Indigenous cultural heritage sites. Shown here are these axe grinding grooves at Little Rocky Creek, and on the neighbouring Land for Wildlife property, which is the Scout property, you can see this lovely scar tree. So I just want to pay my respects and acknowledgement at this point in time to the Jinnabarra and Cubby Cubby people, traditional owners, their old people, elders and emerging elders as well. So in terms of conservation values, I mean, there's two iconic species that we will probably know about, the Richmond birdwing butterfly and the koala, both listed as threatened. And the councils provide various levels of support for private landholders to look after and hopefully expand the population of these animals in that area. What's less talked about is the lesser known threatened species, and one of these is this recently discovered in the Pumicestone Passage, the dwarf Mullany spiny crayfish, Euasticus eurospinosus. Here's it's just its claw, but this was detected on a Land for Wildlife property by a very active Land for Wildlife member at Mount Melham, who's just got a really keen eye and is very determined to document the conservation values on their property. The platform that I've shown this slide in is in an iNaturalist record. So both of the Sunny Coast Council and Moreton Bay Council areas support their Land for Wildlife members through offering an iNaturalist projects for both councils for Land for Wildlife members. And one landholder at Mount Melham, Land for Wildlife landholder, he's had 29,000 observations of over 5,000 species. Obviously, 90% of those are invertebrates. He puts out a night sheet every night and just photographs the moths and all the various insects that come in. So, some people take conservation, to an amazing step. And again, we're still discovering what's on a lot of our properties. Here's people undertaking some weed management and, threat mitigation activities on those properties. So planting, weed control is is one of the key activities that Land for Wildlife members do. So moving down the catchment sort of to this lowlands area, this is that area that's been really heavily cleared, and both Shannon and Richard's talk really showed that that's a highly fragmented landscape. And we've got sort of a scattering of Land for Wildlife properties around that area, Beerwah, Glasshouse Mountains and Beerburrum. And it certainly poses a challenge for conservation in these fragmented landscapes where there's really, the native vegetation occurs in thin strips along the creeks and in isolated patches. We also obviously have a very successful horticultural industry based on the rich fertile soils that are there. Again, just another challenge, I guess, for conservation. So those patches of native vegetation that do remain in this area are very important for a lot of wildlife species. Shown here is the glossy black cockatoo. It's dependent on these casuarina forests for its food, but mostly it needs really big, large, old eucalypt trees for their hollows. And they're trees that 300-500 years old before a hollow is the size required for these birds to breed in. These photos are from a Land for Wildlife property at Beerburrum, and there's actually some birds coming down to drink at the dam there if you squint and look really closely. Some Land for Wildlife members in this area are undertaking some pretty challenging work. So this is a former pineapple farm. It was probably always quite marginal. Most of that topsoil that would have been on that slope now is downstream, whether that's on neighbouring properties or in the passage itself. And so what we're left with is quite a degraded area. It's struggling to come back with native, regenerating native plants, and it's kind of weedy. There's also a bit of a history of some of that past land use on farming on marginal lands, where we're facing erosion at Coochin Creek, and that's some creek erosion, and then just some basic slumping erosion, both on or adjacent to ex-pineapple farms. So some Land for Wildlife members in this area are undertaking to restore these properties. Shown here is a property that was cleared in 1973. It's a 16-hectare property, so a classic 40-acre soldier settlement place. Cleared in 1973, probably took 2 days to clear. Pineapple farm in early 90s, but it was unsuccessful. It was always marginal and probably not that profitable, and now is moving to the owners very keen for conservation. So we're talking, an incredibly difficult bony site. All the topsoil's long gone. She's planted over 8,000 trees, but very difficult circumstances. Certainly Sunshine Coast Council has provided a lot of support to them in getting these trees on the ground. They have had a 30% loss rate, which is a huge loss rate for any normal site. But given the conditions here, I think the 70% success rate is actually a success for this location. So at this point, I just really want to give a shout out to landholders who are undertaking such difficult projects to really restore areas that were degraded for whatever reason. And, when these landholders bought this property, there was no birds or anything, and now they're delighted to have some bird life come back. In terms of natural regeneration, this site was really only being recolonised by acacias. They've been there for 14 years, and only in the last 18 months have they actually seen some eucalypt actual natural regeneration. So what took 2 days to clear with bulldozers has taken nearly 25 years to actually get a eucalypt seedling to regenerate. And so you can see the decades, centuries, probably millennia it will take if we're looking at restoring it to a previous ecosystem. So a big shout out to Land for Wildlife members and all landholders who are undertaking such works. So moving on to sort of that coastal area, there's not a lot of private landholders, landholdings in that area. We've got a lot of large state forests, we've got extractive industries, a lot of strawberry farms, but we do have a scattering of Land for Wildlife properties east of the highway. And although we don't have a lot in numbers, what the values are on these properties are quite remarkable. So some of them, certainly around the Donnybrook area, have Wallam Heath. That's an endangered ecosystem, and within that there's an incredible amount of conservation values. We've got a property that actually sits on the Pumicestone Passage. It's got water mouse, again a species we heard about yesterday, threatened species. These are two of the endangered species that are found on some of those Wallam Heath properties around Donnybrook, the swamp orchid and the little Wallam sedge frog. And for some of these properties in that coastal area, Moreton Bay Council is working really actively with the landholders to implement appropriate fire management. So they're working with, the Rural Fire Brigade, with local landholders, with reserves, with traditional owners to re-implement appropriate or cultural burning back into this area. So here's an example of a fire that was lit at Wurrum, a planned burn. Prior to the burn, the landholders are involved in going out and assessing and surveying the sites to make sure where the conservation values are. So, if there's threatened species, right, how do we manage them with regards to the burn? And then post-burn, the landholders are also involved in post-fire recruitment monitoring. So really to see how the country responds to those fires. So it's a bit of a new project happening down there, and it's very exciting where that could go and the long-term partnerships that are happening in that area. So I just want to give a shout out to my two colleagues who really helped bring this presentation together. Deanne Attarch from Moreton Bay Regional Council, she's here in the audience today and is very happy to take questions as well. And then my colleague Alan Wynne up on the Sunshine Coast. There's about 30 land for wildlife officers across southeast Queensland, and we do work collaboratively across the councils. There's 13 local governments involved, and it's a really good project. Thank you very much for your time.
We didn't get any questions from the audience, but that clearly means that you have a very clear and concise way of communicating. I'm interested to find out, when Land for Wildlife first started out, I thought to myself, there's going to be a rush to the door and no one behind it there'll be a cohort of people who've been waiting for this for 20 years. They'll all jump in and then that's it. Land for Wildlife will die and we'll just have, that first group of people and no one else. Is that what has happened?
That's really funny. That's like the best plant question that could have happened, in terms of... it's surprising. The growth rate has been roughly consistent, certainly for the last 10 years. About 230 new properties join every year. So yes, when the program started 22 years ago, 1998, 1999 were definitely peak years. But then after that, there's been a very steady climb, 230 properties per year. That's why so much, there's now 30 officers involved in the program. It's had to continue to grow to basically meet that demand. In the calendar year of 2020, we registered 375 new properties. So that beat any other preceding year dramatically. Probably COVID related, people were simply at home more, maybe wanting to connect with nature more, but we're certainly not seeing any decline in the demand from the community for supporting them in conservation. So it's really encouraging, and actually councils are trying to work out how to keep the program sustainable so that they continue to deliver good services to the members and service quality doesn't decline because of the strong demand we're still facing. Thanks.
The whole program started from a community group in Victoria and has spread across Australia, and I think is even an international program now. It happens elsewhere in the world?
It was in New Zealand for a period of time, but that was a trial and it didn't continue. So it is only in Australia, in my understanding. Yes, it's a Victorian-based program. They started in 1981, and it is now delivered across most states. Like most state government funding for nature conservation, that's dried up, and so the program's moved in a lot of the other states to be delivered either by local governments or community groups. It is still delivered in Victoria by the state government, but all volunteer assessors. So southeast Queensland is certainly the only region where it's delivered with the level of resourcing that we have here through local governments. And I think it's quite a unique model in southeast Queensland that we have other structures that allow the local governments to work together. So collaborative, there's the SEQ regional NRM plan and regional plan that gives sort of weight to there being a regional collaboration like here. And also arguably our councils are reasonably well off so that they can afford to invest in nature conservation. Other local governments, they would find that much more difficult. Yeah, thank you. The question was just how secure are nature refuges when we look at the example of Bimblebox. Look, it's a very good question, and people that are entering into any conservation agreement, covenant, either on title through a state government piece of legislation or with the local government, there are out clauses. You know, and everyone should be aware of those. So there's ministerial discretion with regards to nature refuges, and likewise there's local government discretion as well. So while both parties enter into it, there are potentially clauses where they can be ceased. So it's definitely a gap. And I guess the state government became aware of that, and they set up their special wildlife reserves as a new category. That was only implemented last year. That's only for sort of in perpetuity conservation organisations. So that's almost a level of conservation agreement that is at a national park status, but for private entities. So I think there's only one of those, and that's owned by Bush Heritage in Queensland. So yes, it's a very good question. It's a very fair question that people should know about when entering into a covenant is what are their options of that ceasing.